Start. Okay. So I'd like to welcome you all to this member meeting of the Lake County Conservation Council. We have a guest presentation this evening, and the title is Approaches to Preserving Natural Resources in Central Florida. Our speaker is Tom Kay, who's the Executive Director of the Alachua Conservation Trust. Tom graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in environmental policy and behavior and earned his law degree from Florida State University. He serves as chair of the board of directors of the Partnership for Gulf Coast Land Conservation, and also previously served as the president of the Alliance of Florida Land Trust. So I've asked Tom to tell us about the work of the Alachua Conservation Trust in Central Florida, and also about how we might best assist with advocacy, let's say. So please be sure your audio is muted, and use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have during the presentation, and we will transmit those questions and comments to Tom at the end of his presentation. Welcome, Tom.
Appreciate the introduction, Pat, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As Pat sort of noted, I'm with the Alachua Conservation Trust, and what I'm going to do tonight is give you a little bit of an overview of the organization itself, kind of talk about where we're at as a state, and primarily focus more on Lake County itself, and then talk about some of the opportunities that I think are available right now, just based off the fact that we have unprecedented levels of funding, both at a federal and state level, and what that means potentially for Lake County and the ability to conserve lands and preserve lands in that region. And so as the name's a bit of a misnomer, we're actually working across 16 counties primarily in Florida, although we have projects as far west as Okaloosa County in the Panhandle. We own lands in Franklin and Wakulla County, in my old backyard back in the day, just southwest of Tallahassee. We've got conservation projects in St. Johns County, and we also have projects down in the Keys. And a lot of that work primarily is focused on nesting sea turtle habitat protection, and we had some funding for that. But primarily the way we work as an organization is focused on primarily conserving lands, and we do that in one of three main ways. One is donation of land, one is actually acquisition of land, and then leveraging a variety of pots of money, and we'll get into that a little bit tonight, how we do that. And the third way of conserving lands is conservation easements, where that land stays in private ownership, continues to be managed by whoever may own that, whether it's a farmer or a landowner, but they've given up the development rights, the right to mine it and do things like that. And as you can see, this is sort of the map. Lake County became one of the areas that we started working in and having more of a focus in the last 7 to 8 years. We did our first conservation project there in 2017. We had land donated to us in the Howey and the Hills region, ultimately sold that property, but put conservation easements. So it's still in production, primarily for cow-calf operations, but there's no ability to, further develop or subdivide that land. We've had projects, the first picture up there was actually Gum Slough in Sumter County. So we've been down in that same area of Lake County for more than a couple of decades. Actually, we did our first project in Sumter County in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we've had a pretty good presence outside of our namesake for the duration of our time. So this year's pretty important to us. We're celebrating our 35th year, and we've helped conserve over 57,000 acres across north central Florida. I'm just going to highlight here just a few of the other things we do, mostly with pictures, but as I know, the emphasis of our organization is still sort of the backbone of what we're doing is conserving land, but a other part of that, of course, is making sure that there's the next generation that's interested in conservation. And so some of the things that we're doing, and I can use those pictures, those are my twins, two of my 4 kids. So they're in that picture, but trying to get kids out in the thing. So we do a lot of environmental education. We've got a program, we've partnered with a number of other organizations, and the program we have is called the Creek program. It's sort of a second generation of our original Tuscaloosa Learning Center, but taking kids out to one of our preserves that's in Alachua and Putnam County, in Hawthorne, and bringing kids out from both Alachua and Putnam counties, particularly from schools that are, underserved or a lot a greater number of the students are on free or reduced lunch. And so this past year, we brought about 1,500 students, usually geared towards fourth grade. But as you can see, we got kids of all ages come out for the program, particularly in the summer, STEM-based education, but getting them out in the field, getting them into the creek. And we bring in a lot of specialists from different places like IFAS with the university, or for some of the other conservation programs from the university to learn more about the world around them and get them out and understand nature. Because if they don't care about it, if they don't enjoy it, the likelihood of them wanting to, conserve it down the line is far less. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is sort of educate the next generation. Just a couple other examples of that. We've got a Young Leaders for Wild Florida. That was a camp that we started about 6 or 7 years ago. It gets kids out between the ages of about 14 to 19. To get them interested in advocacy is one of the things that we do, as well as just, again, sort of understanding conservation, thinking about careers in conservation. We also have some pictures of, students that are doing internship programs. So we've got, on any given year, we've got about 3 dozen interns a year that come through our organization, from resource management to office things, so helping with acquisitions or outreach or communications. Even given my background with law, I usually have 1 to 2 law students working under me as well, trying to get them engaged and interested in conservation, and making sure that we have attorneys who are going to be able to, advocate for conservation or help landowners through the process of conserving their own lands. Just a couple more examples. We do a lot of prescribed fire, so we do a lot of resource management, both on our own preserves. We have 14 preserves right now that we own and manage. We also own and manage lands for a variety of different government agencies, including the St. Johns River Water Management District, the City of Hawthorne, City of Gainesville, Alachua County, Suwannee River Water Management District, and even the Division of State Land. So while we own and manage about 6,000 acres of our own land, we also manage about 7,000 acres for other government agencies as well. And we also work with private landowners to help put prescribed fire or do habitat restoration, which might include, planting native species or, non-native species. And Lake County is one of the areas we've been serving in that capacity for about 6 years now as well. As this example, that's a bunch of longleaf pine getting ready to get planted into the ground. One of our days working with volunteers. So there's a lot of ways to get engaged and involved with the organization. One of those happens to be, planting trees, which here in Florida primarily happens between November and February is the best time to put longleaf pine or wiregrass plugs into the ground and help with that restoration process. We'll also do a lot with recreation, so trying to get people out onto the landscape to enjoy our natural areas. Again, sort of like the education thing, if you can't get people out there to enjoy about it, they're not going to care about it. So I think one of the big parts of what we try to do with any of our preserves is making sure we get them open to access to the public, so they can enjoy those places, while also trying to minimize the amount of impact it might have on the resources there on the landscape. Just an example, we're doing a kayak outing. This is with our Santa Fe River. The gentleman there, the bald guy, he wouldn't mind me saying that about him, Noah Valenstein. That was the director, executive director for the Department of Environmental Protection for a number of years, at the end of the Scott administration and beginning of the DeSantis administration. And we were having about talking about the need and the importance of having funding in place for conserving the resources within our region. So, but the real bread and butter of our organization, of course, is, again, talking about conservation lands. The picture here is of Orange Lake Overlook. This one, I know this one has some relevance because we had a number of people from Lake County donate it for it. So I put it up there, but that's the old Huff property that if you've driven up 441, come all the way up into Gainesville, you'll pass this in the town of McIntosh. And we bought the piece that actually had the citrus shop on there that was run by Buddy and Ollie Huff from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s into the early 80s until the hard freeze. Acquired that property in 2019, and we just bought the farm to the north of it, an additional this one was, I guess, 71 acres. The other piece was about 86. So we got 155 acres that are now conserved there. But I bring that up because a lot of the properties actually that we've been approached about in Lake County have been, citrus groves or former citrus groves. And so this is, I think, a good example of a property that had a lot of historical significance in addition to its ecological benefits for protection. And a lot of sandhill cranes out there. So a big focus, of course, with our organization, we're conserving lands, obviously clean water, open space, scenic beauty, recreational benefits, agricultural benefits, but also I think at the heart of that, for a lot of us that are interested in conservation, part of the reason I got into this was because I loved animals as a kid, particularly wildlife. I think that's a big component of the work we're working on. And a lot of emphasis is on particularly endangered and threatened species, but also thinking about when we're conserving properties, the idea that, we don't want to have to get to a place where we're putting species on a threatened or endangered species list, because it costs a tremendous amount of money to try to get those species back to, stable numbers. And I think one of the great things that I've been coming across both in my advocacy up in DC, but also in Tallahassee and locally with, different commissions and councils across the state, is that people are starting to recognize that it's better to keep and protect lands now and keep certain species from becoming that point in time where they might need to have a lot more resources thrown at them to try to protect them or keep them alive. I mean, look at how much money we're spending to feed manatees lettuce right now. I mean, $5 to $10 million a year. It's kind of crazy, where we probably could have taken other steps that would have been a lot less expensive, a lot less intensive in resources to ultimately end up in the same place. Just put this up real quick. This is just to highlight a bunch of acquisitions that we just did in the last really 2020 to 2022. So you can see we've been pretty busy acquiring new lands. In 2020, we bought over $10 million of properties. A lot of those were, and I'll talk about this a little bit for us because it's relevant to what we're trying to do on Lake County. We leveraged a lot of private resources, but with state and federal resources to make these acquisitions happen. I also borrowed a lot of money, which gave me a lot of sleepless nights, but ultimately allowed us to get these acquisitions done at a time when the market was really heating up, and there was a lot of, for lack of a better way of putting it, COVID money floating around from the PPP loans that are coming out of the federal government. So there was a lot of cash flow at that point in time, and a desire for people to move out to rural areas because there was a concern of being around others. And so we had to move pretty quickly on a lot of these projects. And then we bought some of them and then ultimately flipped them back to become conservation lands that are managed and owned by other agencies like the Water Management District or the Division of State Lands and Environmental Protection with the state of Florida. So this is Florida, right? Welcome to Florida, right? This is kind of what we're seeing, the challenge we're facing. In I think the heart of why I'm talking with you all tonight is that we have an unprecedented level of growth in the state. I mean, for as long as I've been here, 20 plus years, and I've been coming here since I was a little kid because I had a lot of family down in the East Coast and Tequesta and West Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale. So I remember driving down through the groves of Lake County as a kid, coming down to visit them and seeing that transition. Nothing's probably more shocking than what's happened in Lake County. I mean, pretty hard to beat that. I mean, if you look at what happened, around Montour and going back up in that whole area, as far as the amount of development coming out of the villages on south, coming across the turnpike, it's pretty heartbreaking. And so this is sort of the scene that we have in Florida, and kind of give us an idea what we're looking at. Most people probably seen some of the Florida 2070 plans. Peggy Carr and others were responsible for putting up this, but kind of give us an idea of what the trend is looking like for population growth in the state of Florida as a whole. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in Lake County specifically, but you can kind of see that the anticipated numbers are 33.7 million. If we were to look at what just happened in the last year in the state of Florida, where instead of like 1,000 new residents, we're looking at more like 1,412 residents a day moving into the state, and that, these numbers are probably going to be way off. We'll probably be at 40 million. Now, the reality is it's probably not going to hold up, and we'll look at that why that's the case. This is from another study that was done just in the last couple of years, looking at overall projected change in population. Look at Florida's already the third most populated state in the country, and you look at like projected growth from 2020 to 2040, and it's pretty eye-popping to see what Florida looked like. I think about when my grandparents moved down here in 1959, and like I remember my grandmother was saying like the population's like it was only 2.2 million people in Florida. I mean, it's a dramatic change, and a lot of that's due to many factors, the lack of state income tax, a great climate, air conditioning, of course, helped the state of Florida a lot. And a number of other factors that made it, an appealing place to retire and make a lot of people want to move here. So there's that going on for us, and something we're just going to have to deal with as a state, and why I think makes conservation so important. The other thing that's really affecting a lot of us that are inland here, I think this is a good slide to share, is this is the loss, based off of flooding in the state by sea level. This comes from First Street. They got some great stuff. I've got the source listed down there, but they're a really good source to look at, and one that the mortgage and insurance industry relies on for what stuff's going on. But you see that massive loss in value as a result of the changing climate in the state of Florida. And the reason I think that's relevant is that, people are not necessarily, moving out of Florida. They're moving to our area because it's higher and drier, right? We don't have to worry about it as much as those on the coast. And I've been seeing it a lot in Alachua and Putnam, Gilchrist, Marion County. I can't speak to as much in Lake County, but what I call sort of the washing machine. You got folks coming down from up north, come down to South Florida, and then they're coming back up to where we're at. And I think we're having what, for lack of a better way of putting it, is, climate refugees, where folks are moving off those coasts and coming into our area. And so that's putting additional pressures on us in Central Florida. And then to kind of put it all in perspective, not only are we one of the fastest growing states in the country, but Lake County is one of the fastest growing counties in the entire country. 38% increase over the last 12 years. When you think about that, there was less than 300,000 residents in Lake County in 2010, and then as of July of last year, there's 410,000. I mean, it's pretty astronomical, and yet it's still not. You look at population density, is still not overpopulated by comparison to a lot of other countries. Go visit someplace like Ireland or some of the other European nations. I mean, we still have a lot to go in density, but it definitely feels like it every time you probably go out to the grocery store or try to make a run to do your errands. If you got to get into a car, you can feel it. And so we got that challenge facing us here in Lake County. So I wanted to touch base on how are we going to address this, particularly from a conservation standpoint. And wanted to just note that, like I said at the outset, we have unprecedented funding at a federal level and at a state level for conservation. State level is probably back to where it really needs to be. There's $50 million basically every year for springs restoration funding. Florida Forever this year has about $86 million, but they've got about another $800 million that they have earmarked for the Ocala to Osceola project area, and then another project down in Collier County. I'll touch base on those a little bit, but there's a lot of funding available. That O2O funding in particular has the potential to be used in Lake County in that northeast corner from Wekiva up to Ocala National Forest. That area has potential to be used in that area. So there's that funding available. Rural Family Lands has $100 million this year in the budget. That's for agricultural easements provided by the state. The federal government, I'll dive into that deeper with a couple extra slides on their own, but there's a multitude. I won't go through the alphabet soup, but every single program right now has a tremendous amount of money in it, from Land and Water Conservation Fund, the National North American Wetland Conservation Act funding, and the biggest one being the Farm Bill and the Ag Land Easement Program, or Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. That funding is at levels we will probably never see again in our lifetime. I mean, if you talk to anybody, they'll say you'll never see levels of funding the way it is right now. And there's a whole multitude of other funding programs geared towards climate resiliency, green infrastructure, and things like that also have the potential to fund conservation projects. So there's a lot there. And of course, local and county funds. There's a lot of places that are passing ballot initiatives. That's one of my things to talk about tonight. The need for a local funding source, because every single one of those state and federal programs require match funding. So you can leverage, some of that state funding with some of that federal funding. But really, if you want to get your fair share, you need to have a local funding source. There's other pots of money certainly can be tapped into, like from public utilities. Obviously, individual philanthropic things. A lot of our funding comes from just, individuals who care about conservation, private family foundations or family offices. But right now, where the bulk of that funding really is that state and federal level. And we just have never had funding the way we have. And I think it's a real opportunity for Lake County, and why I think like taking action now is critical. I mean, probably should have been done a couple of years ago, but I think the winds are there now where that could happen. So the iron is still hot. It's not like we've missed the door on it. It just means it needs to happen probably next year. So just kind of give you an idea, this map I pulled up from the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. Just kind of gives you an idea, Lake County here. I bet you can all kind of tell that's Lake George up there. This is kind of area. It gives you an idea of the different conservation areas that are in existence as we stand today. So, because of the program that started in 2004 in Lake County, there is some locally owned conservation lands, water management district, the federal government primarily, that brown tan area up here, that's Ocala National Forest. That's about 80, it's 383,000 acres in total. About 85,000 acres of that's in Lake County. And there's areas around Lake Norris and some of the other lakes that have larger conservation areas. The St. Johns River Water Management District has conservation lands. But as a whole, I mean, I think there's a lot more opportunity for conservation in Lake County, and it's also needed. This is a sort of the same map. That baby blue that's added in there, though, those are what's called Florida Forever project areas. So those lands have been nominated as potential conservation lands to be acquired by the state of Florida. And so when I talked about that, like funding they have right now, $86 million thereabouts. Now they have that much larger pot of money, which includes about $400 million for the Ocala, the Osceola National Forest, and I'll show that map in a little bit in greater detail. That working area, this area in the sort of northeast corner of that baby blue up there, which is the Wekiva to Ocala Greenway, that project area has potential to get funded out of that pot of money. So you can see there's definitely already been identified, at least at a state level, certain areas for additional conservation in Lake County. I just threw this up, sort of the biggest, like I said, the biggest pot of money right now is the Farm Bill. This is a piece that we put together when we went up. I go up to DC every year for a fly-in. For advocacy days to go talk to all of our elected officials. I generally speak to everyone across the state of Florida, not just the regions where we have our stuff. Because as Pat noted, I work on a regional, and I've been the head of the state organization for all the land trusts for about 7 or 8 years. And so as a result of that, I get the joy of going to talk to all of our elected officials. And I say, though, the one great thing is if you just went up to DC and went there to talk conservation, you'd think our government's totally functional, because I'm as well received on both sides of the aisle, which is really nice. I think and you see that in this funding, right? You see that the level of funding that's right now coming out of the federal government, that I think both sides understand like why this is critically important to keep funding in place for conservation initiatives. So they get a gold star for that anyways. So the program I really want to kind of touch base on, I'm going to focus on this quite a bit, because we've got a project getting teed up here that includes Lake County in our next iteration that we're putting in as a grant proposal. And it's really, I think, more than probably any other reason why, if not even look at the state funding, why Lake County should really have its own local funding source in place to take advantage of this stuff. So the Regional Conservation Partnership Program comes out of the Farm Bill. It's federal funding that's run through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or some of you might be familiar with NRCS, to protect sort of like non-industrial farmland. So ideally, it's primarily used for like local farmers, small operators. I mean, sometimes they can be very large tracts, but the idea is like it's not con ag or something like that they're trying to do. They're trying to work with the smaller producers, family run lands. And so the thing that's sort of blowing your mind is this authorization for the Regional Conservation Partnership Program was first authorized in 2014, was re-upped in the 2018. They're looking at it again for what is going to be the 2023 Farm Bill, which I was told when I was up in DC that they will make it happen because it's just too important. The farm bill, in addition to a lot of the stuff that has to do with like the conservation side of things and the agricultural production, is also the one that deals with SNAP and food stamps and all those sort of social safety nets that we have in there. So that is part of that bill as well. And the big fight usually is between which side of that's getting more money, or there's strings attached with it. But my understanding is that they will try to get that bill done before the end of the year, one way or the other, because it's kind of too important for the country. That's probably more, shop than you want to hear, but that kind of gives you an idea. What's really impressive is that with the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, the idea to try to jumpstart, the economy, one more step to jumpstart the economy, make sure it didn't fall into, a recession, and also try to help protect farmers and keep some of these lands in their families, keep them in agricultural production, protect domestic food security, which I think we all realize was really important, particularly when supply chains were falling apart during the pandemic. They put $4.95 billion, almost $5 billion into the RCPP program, which just kind of give you an idea, man. So like you look at these numbers over here that I got shared, it's like there's 300 million. On top of that, there's 250 million for 23, $800 million on top of that 300 million for 24, $1.5 billion in 25, and in 26, $2.4 billion for this program. And this is primarily for purchasing conservation easements on agricultural lands. Now, if it's held by the federal government, it can be 100% of the purchase of that conservation easement, which is, that's where the land is staying in private ownership, but people are giving up their development rights. It was at the time before this pot of money came in, you had to have, for every $1 you asked for, and it was capped at $10 million. So if you wanted to ask for $10 million, you needed to have $20 million of match funding, which meant the partnership part comes in. That's where, even organizations like you come into play. You need to have match funding to come in to leverage these dollars. In this new iteration with the Inflation Reduction Act funding, you can now apply for up to $25 million of funding. And there's they haven't defined yet what the match is, but it's really more one-to-one. So where you used to have like 20 million to get 10, in the proposal I'm going to share with you, we're probably going to put up $26 million in match for $25 million in funding from the feds. And because it's pretty complex and you got to have a special skill set to kind of understand how to put these grants together, there's a finite number of people who can kind of do these proposals. So it is just a tremendous amount of money that could be used to protect conservation lands, primarily agricultural lands, in Lake County. So just kind of flash through real quick some of these maps where we have our conservation working areas. I note the Florida Wildlife Corridor, the relevance to that. It doesn't actually, there's the corridor actually kind of does come through Wake Norris and the Ocala area. These areas are sort of lands they've identified as potential properties to help keep. They're not in conservation yet, but that it could keep, the wildlife corridor for larger species like black bear, allow them free range and be able to roam in the landscapes that they need to keep some of these things connected, and also keep, the genetic mix pretty good for larger species. So it doesn't come right through Lake County, but it comes pretty close to it. So I think it's, relevant to share. And a lot of the money coming out of the state right now is sort of geared towards, because they've done a good job lobbying towards where these projects are, where the Florida Wildlife Corridor exists. I talked about the Ocala to Osceola area. So this is the Ocala to Osceola connector. This actually is a regional conservation partnership program. It's a lot of things, but it has a regional conservation partnership program with NRCS in play. And as you can see, it scoops that sort of what I call south, I guess I call it northeast corner of Lake County there. So it's in that area. So lands in that area qualify for some of that state funding that's going to be specifically made available for just the O2O. That RCPP is run by North Florida Land Trust, which is based out of Jacksonville. We are a partner on that one, though, and part of like our efforts, because we've got more of a footprint in that area, is working on the land in Marion County and Lake County as a result of that. So while they're the lead, there's a lead partner on every single one of these. There's other organizations like ourselves are involved to help with the outreach, because that's a very large working area. In 2020, we put together one that we called Surface to Springs, focused primarily on protecting clean water and the springs in our region. So that project we put in for $10 million. They have lots of projects coming from all over the country. We ended up getting about $7.15 million. So that we've been using that for the last couple of years and doing the big part. One of the big benefits is being able to do outreach to landowners and make them aware of the programs that are out there and also the opportunities that are available for conserving their land. Last year, we put in for Forested Gulf, another regional conservation partnership program. Again, we put in for $10 million. We got about $7.85 million for that. That's over several years. The primary focus, again, is buying conservation easements on ag land. And in the case of this one, we're sort of leveraging Alachua County has a local funding source, right? They have wild spaces, public places. So we're leveraging that local funding source plus some state and some state funding from the Department of Environmental Protection and from the Florida Department of Agriculture Consumer Services to leverage and get the funding in place to pull in that federal dollars. And we did a similar thing here where we pulled in Alachua County again because they have that half-cent sales tax for the next 10 years. We're using that to leverage, actually do conservation in other counties that don't have funding sources in place. So our big focus area there was really kind of see Citrus County, Western Marion County, and Levy County, particularly Eastern Levy County, along Gothi and things like that, where there's real high pressure from horse farms and the conversion of forest into industrial agriculture. And then really what my for the last 5 minutes I have here focused on our project that we're working on right now, where we're going to be applying for this funding in August, middle of August. It's called Lake to Lagoon. You can see what we're doing here is we're working with Volusia County is the sort of the main funding source. They have Volusia Forever. They passed a ballot initiative in 2020, protect environmentally sensitive lands, agricultural lands, their water resources. We're leveraging their local funding source as well as some of our state partners funding to work on protecting conservation lands in the area. But we've also been in discussions with Wake County, with some of your county commissioners, and we're scooping in just a small part of Wake County and explain why, and scooping in part of Flagler County as well. Part of that is the state has projects in those areas, so they know that they could leverage potentially some of those dollars. And because there's so much money that I alluded to earlier, we don't necessarily want to cover the entire county in one proposal because we want multiple bites of that apple given the funding coming out every single year. So this is a proposal that we're working on right now, kind of a little bit closer look at it from a different perspective with this map here, just kind of give you an idea of the projects and the counties that we're working in with each one of these proposals. And this gives you a little closer idea. So, a big priority for us in this one will, of course, be that Wekiva to Ocala Greenway. We're working with the Friends group down there as potentially one of our partners on this project for outreach and engagement. And this is sort of what it looks like, right? So I know I threw a lot of stuff at you, but, we're talking about applying for $25 million. What's that going towards? Purchasing conservation easements. There's also land management contracts. So whether it's, fencing cattle out of certain areas to protect water resources, there's a whole multitude. It's over 100 different land management practices, but basically working with the cost share with the landowners to protect the natural resources, whether it's for wildlife habitat, water protection, prescribed fire, if that's appropriate on the landscape. And it also funds a certain amount of reimbursing partners' expenses, not just ours, but other partners in the project. And you can kind of see here right now who's sort of already on the board and who we're working with. We're working pretty extensively with Stetson. The East Central Florida Regional Planning Council has also been pretty heavily involved in this one. The St. Johns River Water Management District, a number of the ones, if it doesn't say potential, have already signed on sort of as some amount of match funding for us putting this proposal together. But Volusia is sort of the main lead on it because they have their funding source at a local level already in place. And this is just sort of kind of the outcome. So, one of the big takeaways from this is just the ability to leverage dollars. I mean, I'll sound like a broken record, but like, this is what I say to every single county commission I roll into, wherever it is in the state. Like, if you want to tap into those funding sources that are out there right now at a state or federal level, you really need to have a local match funding source. And I think one of the other big benefits, like I said, like, I think before we got on to the actual presentation itself, I think one of the big challenges, like what our outreach and why I haven't done more is, you need a funding source to kind of do that outreach. Like, outreach just doesn't happen on its own. You need to have dollars and someone committed to doing that and being consistent and doing that outreach to landowners to say, hey, I'm interested, and doing it in a very sort of targeted way. And this would allow us to do that, start that process in Lake County, and have a staff person dedicated specifically for doing that outreach and trying to get them engaged, whether it's, improving land management practices or putting the property into conservation with a conservation easement. Those are certainly outcomes. And just to kind of give you an idea, that $25 million, about 21 million of that would go towards conservation easements. The other part would go towards like land management contracts. And then there's a whole slew of other things that have to get funded with different partners. So dollars are moving different places, but that's sort of the general outcome of what this proposal would look like. And that's a lot of money. And if you think about, if you have your own ballot initiative, when Lake County did theirs in 2004, that was $33 million. If you thought you could leverage that, wouldn't necessarily be dollar to dollar, but say you got even 80% of that, you're really stretching how far that funding is going. And so I just kind of note that here. This is probably one of my biggest takeaways for everyone here, is trying to get the ballot initiatives. I shared, Alachua County's passed 4 of them. I've been the chair for 2 of them, the last 2 running those campaigns. And I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways I can, hopefully you didn't lose me here. There we go. So, and I'm wrapping up here right now. So my last sort of 3 things we can do is, 1, if you have land, consider conserving it. There's a lot of different ways. Don't necessarily have to be paid for it. A lot of people donate their conservation easements or leave their land in their will to be conserved. And or encourage others. You may not be a landowner. You might be living in Mount Dora or someplace like that, or Leesburg or Fruitland, or one of those places, and don't have a lot of land. But think talking to other people you might know that have their land, encourage them to talk about doing this. I think that awareness is probably one of the biggest keys right now, because like I said at the outset, Lake County, we get more calls from Lake County than any other place talking about the need to help conserve lands in that region. It's Lake County 1 and Marion County 2 right now. And a lot of it has to do with the villages on top of the world and some of those developments, and just the pressure coming out of Orlando in general. That's coming towards Lake County. The second one, I think this is really critical. You kind of heard me, I've been a broken record at this point, but, advocating to your local officials, your county commissioners, to re-up that funding for, the public lands management program that was originally put in place in 2004. And I think one of the big things you'll hear, and just thinking about this, is that some people are like, hey, look, we don't, and certainly having fee lands and having places where people can visit, it's really important. There's no doubt. I love the outdoors, and it's kind of what got me into this. But, if some of those dollars are being used to purchase conservation easements, even if there's not public access, the fact that open space is in place and all the protections that provides, including not having to deal with flooding and some of those things, if we're protecting the right resources, is critically important. And I think, making sure, it sounds like at least a few commissioners are on board with this, but making sure they get there and trying to get that back on the, having a ballot referendum or initiative in 24, so that you can take advantage of all this other funding that's in place, because we're ready to, assist Lake County if the funding's in there. I said that I talked about strategically why we protected just that. Right now, and this map only has part of Lake County, is because reality is there's other resources in Lake County that probably need to be protected. And so, I think one of the ones we've been talking about is going back, and it could be its own project area. It's probably multi-counties protecting green swamp. That is a massive resource that's critically important for lots of people's drinking water, probably a third of the state. When you think about, Polk County and down over to Hillsborough County, Hillsborough River runs out of the swamp. So, protecting that as another project area. And I think we could probably look at another one that runs through the middle of the vein of Lake County as another source. So I think there's multiple bites at the, federal level, which is also going to pull in that state funding to conserve resources across there. And the last one's a simple one, right? You can, donate to organizations like us or other land trusts that are working. We're not the only one working in Lake County. Green Horizon Land Trust, Rochelle Seltzer, who's the ED down there. They're based out of Polk, but they work in Lake County. I've sent projects to Putnam Land Conservancy, who are based out of like the western part of Putnam County, like Interlochen, Hawthorne area. I've passed some deals that we couldn't do that they could in Lake County over to them. Conservation Florida is working in Lake County. So there's a lot of us that are doing stuff in Lake County. So I think, we're trying to partner and work on all this stuff, make this stuff happen. But that's the other way of making this happen. Of course, keep doing the work that you're doing to kind of make and highlight the importance of conservation. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Tom, thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. And Agor, do you want to start with the questions?
Yes, I do. Tom, is conservation trust and land trust the same thing?
Can you say that one more time?
Is conservation trust and land trust the same thing?
It should be. I mean, generally speaking, the idea of what is a land trust, that's probably sort of a basic thing. The idea of is an organization that's focused on conserving lands or preserving lands. And generally speaking, if you look at like the language that's used for, that I won't go into the whole history. I actually taught transactional conservation law at UF as well. But if you look at the sort of the history of where this came out of, it actually came out of Massachusetts. That's why you see a lot more land trusts out of the Northeast. But the idea of basically these entities that would acquire lands for public benefit, for public trust, in perpetuity, in essence. So it's in essence the same thing. If you saw an organization that has conservancy or land trust or conservation trust, they're all basically the same concept of that idea of like, generally speaking, historically was acquiring lands and holding on to them for purposes of the public benefit and their conservation values.
The Alachua Land Trust, is that the correct name?
Alachua Conservation Trust.
Alachua Conservation Trust operates some in Northeast County. Are there multiple trusts serving Lake County, and how does a landowner choose which one?
Yeah, so I mean, there are multiple, as I sort of mentioned there at the end. The Green Horizon Land Trust, which is based out of Polk County. I'm not sure where Rochelle is actually based in Polk County. I know it's done some work in Lake County. Putnam Land Conservancy has done some work there. Conservation Florida has done some work there. The Nature Conservancy around Wekiva Springs and stuff like that has also done stuff. They're a national organization, international organization, have also done some work, although they're doing less of the land conservation work these days than they have historically, but they're still doing some, particularly around Wekiva. So yeah, I think the question is just tight. It's a matter of, for Lake County, a matter of just kind of reaching out and seeing, depending on what you're trying to do with the work you're trying to do, just trying to see the type of project, who's the best fit for your thing. It's not as clear cut as, some of the other counties.
Yeah, that's true. Would the funds generated by a voter referendum qualify for matching funds for other funding?
Yeah, absolutely. It is like the most ideal pot of money to leverage.
And what can you tell us about the process of creating a resolution to present to voters?
Well, I think, generally speaking, there's one of two ways it's done. The easier of the two ways to do it is your county commission, the board of county commissioners would, make that decision and take it to a vote of them. And there's a process they have to follow for that. But basically take that up, make that decision, and then put that on their ballot. The alternative, and I imagine it's the same in Lake County. It seems like it's every other community I've worked in is the same. You can gather signatures and basically, I don't know what the standard is in Lake County, but you gather signatures and basically push to have it put onto the ballot. The challenge with that, of course, is you'd have to start that probably like right now if you're going that process, because you need to have all those signatures gathered, right, just like any kind of initiative or referendum or amendment, and you got to do the number of signatures. It's based off the number of voters in your community. I think it's 10%. You've got to gather those signatures. It's a pretty intensive process. So it'd be a lot easier, if your commission just made that move, just make that decision to say, hey, we're going to put this on the ballot and let the voters decide.
How large an area does it have to be? Jacqueline wants to know, to be considered for a trust.
So, I mean, our smallest projects, I mean, I've got like postage stamps on in the Keys. But we're protecting nesting sea turtle habitat there. Generally speaking, if we're talking Lake County, we just took a farm in Marion County that was 10 acres. So, the reality is usually you're trying to go for like 40 acres, but I've had projects where it's 10 acres. If you were in an urban area, we did a park in Gainesville that was, an acre. And it's a much different function, right? There's a lot of different tree varieties. It's an educational sort of a spot. We actually had a fitness organization, a company donate equipment for that. And it's got like a walking trail and a tree tutorial. So it could be smaller. It depends where it's at. I mean, we wouldn't want to have like 1 acre in the middle of nowhere, but if it was next to a Ocala National Forest or Lake Norris or something like that, that's a different story. I think there's a lot of different things that play out at it, but generally speaking, probably usually like at least a minimum of 10 acres, but there's definitely a lot of exceptions to that.
Thank you. Peggy Keller says, thank you for a fantastic presentation. Is there a specific legal term for conservation easements, or is that just a loosely used term or potential property can be funded by the federal state conservation easement?
Yeah, so that is a specific term. Usually the document that's recorded with that is a deed of conservation easement. And the thing with that is it travels with the land. So in every state except for North Dakota, they can be in perpetuity. North Dakota only allows them to be for 99 years. State of Florida, you can do it under Florida statute 70406. You can have a conservation easement, it goes on the property, it runs with the land. So you put an easement on your property, you sell it, it keeps continuing to stay with the land. So those restrictions stay with that property perpetually. And then sort of the key, I think an important point is it has to be a third party holding that. That could be the government, it could be the federal government, the state government, it could be Lake County, it could be ACT holding that conservation easement, but a third party has to hold that conservation easement and enforce the terms of it. And that's usually done by going out to the property once a year and monitoring it, making sure that, they haven't put a bunch of condos on there, or they haven't turned a cow calf operation into, a massive pig farm or something, or, a concentrated agricultural facility or something along those lines.
Do you think a small sales tax is a good funding source? I think that's what we used in Lake County, or is ad valorem better?
Well, so that's the part of like, I think for Lake County, if they were going to do the ballot initiative, we talked about Seminole County's doing one coming up here. Getting a trust for public land involved, they do most of the ballot initiatives. If you look at their success rate, they're like 86%. I think the last one was like 93%. Every ballot initiative they worked on last year in the state of Florida in 22 passed, including the one in Alachua County. I would say, for me, sales tax feels like for most people more equitable in the sense that everyone's paying for that in some ways. And like in Alachua County, it makes a lot of sense because we have a lot of dollars coming from out of county as a result collected from sales tax because of the University of Florida and all the football and athletic events. So of the sales tax that's collected in that county, 67% is coming from residents, or 66%, and about 33 or 34% is coming from out of county. So the sense is that other people that are visiting and using your resources are paying that sales tax. The flip side of that, and it's probably longer than you wanted, ad valorem has also been done. The first iteration of Alachua County's program was done with an ad valorem tax. But the push on that one is that a lot of times that burden is then only carried by those who are homeowners. Although you'd think that if you owned a home, you have more financial wherewithal. Although there's also, that there's was so trickled down, I guess, in the sense that if you are a renter, if there's additional ad valorem, it's probably getting caught into your rent. So you're going to get caught either way. Personally, my general preference, if we've done the last couple in Alachua County, the last 3 actually have been sales tax. I just feel like it's kind of an easier pill to swallow. I'm also not living hand to mouth, so things are different in that scenario. But I generally feel like that's a better way of doing it than than the ad valorem tax on your thing. And there's other things. There's bed taxes for hotels. I've seen a lot of different things done around the country, but generally, I would say probably sales tax is the way to go.
How far into Lake County does that Lake to Lagoon project come?
Primarily, if you want me to pull that map back up real quick for y'all, you can kind of see it here on this map pretty good. It is sort of that northeast corner there, so it's got a decent chunk, but not the whole thing. And that like I said, I think the big intent is the hope that there's going to be ballot initiative, and that we would do future regional conservation partnership program proposals that would cover other parts of Lake County. Probably the one that seems to have the most, in talking with staff at the county and some of the elected officials, around Green Swamp will probably be the next priority based off of what I've seen. But I think that's one of those things you work with staff and you come up with a proposal, what makes the most sense.
Do you have any idea what forms that western boundary? I mean, obviously it's a county boundary at some point, but
Yeah, I think
is it a road?
I think I think it was a road that actually made that decision. I wasn't, even though I've been in every single one of the meetings, I think on this thing, I wasn't, the one necessarily making that, drawing that line the way it was. The other part of it was, I think it has to do with the way the Ocala National, the O to O proposal was done too. There's a bit of overlap that way too.
Right. But Tom, I have a personal question. We have seen a takeover of a local agency that used to have conservation land. And I'm personally trying to figure out, is having somebody like St. John's used to be a safe haven for holding conservation lands. And now I don't feel as comfortable about that. Am I unfounded in that, or is that a trend of concern?
That's a general, I mean, I think that's part of the rise of relevance for land trust has been that there's a concern that during the past government administration, they were trying to surplus all sorts of lands, like stuff that should never. Unfortunately, some of that stuff, stuff that was bought with Preservation 2000, it was written so tight, there was really no way for the government to, state to sell some of that stuff without a lot of hand wringing. But one of the ways too, if Lake County was the one to acquire some of these lands, what we've done in both the city of Gainesville and Alachua County, and we were involved with those initiatives, we created a list of the Registry of Protected Places. So once the land is acquired with that funding from the ballot initiative, it then goes on this Registry of Protected Places. The only way that property could be sold that's been acquired with those funds is if it goes back to the voters and the voters pass by 2/3 supermajority, that land can be sold for some other purpose. And that's the level of protection. I think that's a good idea. The other thing you could do, and we've been doing this with other places, is, make co-owners or co-grantees of an easement, so that there's a backup already in place. Now the government doesn't exactly love that thing, but I've been doing some projects. For example, we bought some land. We bought a spring up in Columbia County, and the water management district sort of helped put protections in there and help us reduce our cost. Bought a conservation easement off of us at a reduced price, of course, for that. So we have the property in fee. It's going to be a nature preserve for people to enjoy and kayak the Santa Fe River and Alusty Creek, but the district also has an easement, so there's 2 levels of protection on that property. And I think you're going to see more and more of that, just because you saw, I didn't want to bring it up because it's sort of like a black eye, but that Audubon group that's trying to sell that piece of property that was given for conservation, which is like a nightmare to probably anyone who's ever made a donation to any charitable organization, right?
Yeah. We have time for one more, Pat, or?
Yeah, go ahead and finish your questions. We had one from Tom Haller. Did that get covered?
I don't know, but Deborah Shelley's asked about, do you have any information or relationship with the folks that have formed a PAC to pass an initiative in Lake County, I think?
Yeah, I do not have, I've not been contacted by them for donation or insight,
Okay.
not yet.
That's about all that I see, Pat, unless somebody else wants to.
Can land be preserved as raw land, or does it have to have trails, parks, etc.?
Really all depends on what the I've had property that's been left to us where the landowners do not want to have public access. And so we've taken lands that way as well, where they want basically to be just a straight nature preserve, no public access. The one thing we always sort of, even the one I've got like that right now, the one exception I say, well, can we do the Christmas bird count? Only because it allows us to collect data for Audubon and stuff like that. And that's like the one exception that we've had with those things. But yeah, it's definitely possible.
Okay, so it can be either way.
Yes.
Jane had a question. Lake County is rapidly losing rural lands to annexation by the cities. Are there other ways in addition to conservation trusts that we can stop urban sprawl?
That is a great question. I don't have the answer to that. If I did, I would be wealthy right now. I think you're seeing that happen. Like we've seen it all over the place. It's happened in Ocala. It's happened in Newberry, a lot in Trenton. There's a bunch of communities where that stuff is happening. I don't have the answer. I mean, the only way to get around that, I think one thing trying to do, which is probably really important in that sense, is getting in touch with some of the other neighbors around there. And at least, if you could start putting some of those lands in conservation around there, to kind of, I hate to say that, but kind of block the ability to make that annexation, because you can't really get around that land then. I mean, that'd be one way of doing it. And I've got some folks who are trying to make that happen.
We've had some people do that locally, and they found out that they could annex through the parkland, because that's not a stop. Unfortunately, currently in the law. You got to check that one out. We have a case here in Lake County we'll tell you about.
Okay. That's pretty painful.
Yes, it is. Believe me. It's in my neighborhood. So that's it,
Well,
Pat.
So we won't come up with an answer to that question anytime soon, I guess. Does anyone else want to make a comment or ask a question? I think we've gone through the ones in the chat box. We want to thank you again, Tom. This is give us a lot of food for thought.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Appreciate all your efforts.
Excellent. So we will now adjourn to our business meeting. And so you could stay for our business meeting if you like, but if you don't want another meeting,